Welcome, everybody. My name is Thomas Woldegergis, and this is a seminar organized by the Association of Eritrean Studies. And the Association of Eritrean Studies is an independent, non-political, non-sectarian scholarly association organized to do these purposes, promote scholarly research on Eritrea and its surrounding regions, serve as a forum for scholarly endeavor on issues related to Eritrea, publish and produce timely, up-to-date research results on Eritrea and Eritreans, organize forums, conferences, and social media events by which to stimulate and disseminate knowledge about Eritrea and Eritreans, and support members by providing a platform for networking opportunities. As I said, this is an independent organization, and membership to the Association of Eritrean Studies is open to anyone who is interested in the mission of the association. And we have an official journal, Eritrean Studies Journal. It's a peer-reviewed open access international journal. And the aim and scope of the journal is to publish peer-reviewed original research contributions, review articles, and book reviews on subjects related to Eritrea, and they could be in any field, including humanities and social sciences, public health, and other stuff. And we are getting ready to publish the first issue of the journal at the beginning of next year, and we are accepting manuscripts. And if you want to publish your work in the Journal of Eritrean Studies Journal, you can email it to this address, or you can write your email address in the chat, and we'll get in touch with you. And the association was incorporated in 2021. It's registered in the state of Illinois, and we have a website, and we are registering and accepting members. And if you are interested, you can just write your email and we'll reach to you. And as I said, we are accepting manuscripts for the first issue of the journal, and you can send your manuscripts to eritreanstudiesaa@gmail.com. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Joseph Venosa of Salisbury University in Salisbury, Maryland. Joseph Venosa is an associate professor of history at Salisbury University in Salisbury, Maryland. He's a native of New York City. He earned his Ph.D. in African history from Ohio University in 2011. And he also has a Master's of Arts in International Affairs. He teaches courses in modern African history, Pan-Africanism, and global history. His major research focus has been examining the role of Islam and political identity in Eritrea during the pre-armed struggle of the 1940s and 1950s. He also examines broader issues such as the role of Islam in modern African nationalism and issues within growing Eritrean diaspora. He is author of the book, which is based on his PhD dissertation by the title Path Toward the Nation, Islam Community and Early Nationalism in Eritrea, 1941 to 1961. And for those of you who want to read his dissertation, you can download it from the Ohio University website, and you can also buy his book from Amazon and other places. Before I leave the stage to Dr. Venosa, I want to remind you, we are recording this meeting on video, so mute your microphones. And if you have any questions, there will be a question and answer session at the end of his presentation, and you can wait until that time, or you can type your questions on the chat space. And if you want to join the Association of Eritrean Studies, just write your email address on the chat space, and we'll get in touch with you. And we are on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and you can check out the videos of this seminar in a few days and previous seminars we had on our YouTube channel. And if you want to hear from us about upcoming seminars, you can write your email addresses and get in touch with you. With that, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Venosa, and you can go ahead and share your screen, Joe.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. It's very nice to meet you all. Eritrea, حجي أبزي وانزي فتاي نايتغرينيا حمائي سلزي كابا زي نتبي بإنجلش كزاربية. Same with my Arabic. It was once good and now it's gone. So my apologies. Although my English is also not so good, so I will try my best. But it is wonderful to meet some of you and see some of my old friends and mentors, and I very much appreciate the opportunity, especially for those of you in the United States. It's a very nice day on the East Coast. So if you are on the East Coast, thank you for taking such a beautiful day off and listening. So what I would like to do, I guess, is basically go back to what I was asked to present on, which is essentially the core topic that I've spent most of my career researching, which is how does the diversity of Eritrea and how does the differences of language and especially religion, how did it actually prove to be a source of strength in the early movement to build an Eritrean nation? I was always fascinated by that issue, and I feel that that is something that can teach a lot of societies about the value of diversity, and also about the generation that came up together in the 1940s and 50s, and how they used those differences as a source of strength. So that's what I was always interested in examining, and that's what I based my dissertation on, and that's what I did the book on. What I would like to do is give a very short presentation, because I don't want to just talk too much. I would like to make this a conversation between people and scholars, and so I'll try not to talk more than 15 or 20 minutes, and then hopefully we can talk about the issues that I examined in the book and that are still, I think, very important. Okay, so I'm going to just try to share the screen. One moment, please. Let's see. Share screen. This one. Okay.
Okay, that's good.
Good. Give me one moment. Can you see it all?
Yes, we can
Beautiful.
see it.
Okay, great. So yeah, the title of this short talk is basically a variation of the book title, Paths Toward the Nation. What I'd like to focus on, more so than just the research, is also this idea of diversity in the Eritrean context, and talk a little bit about how this early period, I think, is so unique to not just Eritrea's history, but the history in modern Africa, and especially in the Horn of Africa. As all of you know here, again, I'm going to very short overview. I don't know if there are any non-Eritreans or non-Habesha in the audience, but for those Ferengi who are there, just as an overview, there are 9 ethnic groups principally in Eritrea, and that difference in ethnicity also has with it a difference in religion. In general, there are obviously 2 major religious communities. You have Christians, mainly Tawahado, Orthodox Christians, and then you have Sunni Muslims. Now you have some diversity within those communities, different kinds of Sufi groups within the Muslim community, and of course you have Pente, Catholic, and Kanisha groups within the Christians, but generally it's a society divided between Muslim and Christian believers with these 9 ethnic groups. So there's always a tremendous difference. Now that's not unique in the creation of African colonies, but what my big argument has been is that Eritrea, more than other societies under colonial rule, utilized these differences and made them a source of strength in the early period. And that religious diversity and that ethnic diversity over time, at least leading up until the armed struggle, actually had a lot of depth, even more so than I think scholars realize or appreciate. And so I was always fascinated in this early period because so much of Eritrean history and discussion is about what happens during the armed struggle, everything from 1961 onward up until now. I was always interested in, what I call the struggle before the struggle, this 20-year period where a society that had been carved up by Italian colonial rule that brought together these different peoples, created a sense of nationhood gradually, despite these differences. So I was always fascinated that this period didn't get more examination, more coverage. And that's what led me to develop my research. When I was at Ohio University, of course, I had the mentorship and help of Dr. Girmay Nagash, who was instrumental in encouraging me to examine this early period. I was able to gain some knowledge of reading Tigrinya and then Arabic, and that unlocked a lot of historical documents for me that I was able to utilize. And so much of the research that I've used in this topic has been looking at the newspapers, the journals, and the private writings of some of the early figures that were involved in this period. So I've tried to use the voices of those people to understand how they engaged these political differences, these cultural differences, and try to build a sense of Eritreanness. I argue in the book that a lot of the core ideology and a lot of the core strength of the early nationalist movement developed within a particular political party, which of course many of you may know, right? The Eritrean Muslim League, or in Arabic, Arabita Islamia Eritrea. They become, in my argument, the major source of ideology in this period. They frame a lot of the written and oral discussions in public in the 1940s and 50s about what makes Eritrea a unique society, and also why that society needed to be defended against Ethiopian dominance. And so my main focus has been looking at this particular organization as a way to understand these ideas. Now, again, the basic timeline, as you know, of Eritrean history is sort of known to all of you, so I'm going to jump in that. But a lot of what I focus on in my book and in the research happens under the period of British military occupation, this period known as the BMA, because this is where, in the post-Italian, post-World War II era, this is where the Eritrean Muslim League, this is where other activists begin to really mobilize. And even though the British military administration very much connived and planned and really has a lot of blame in creating some of the later problems, it still was a moment where there was a new kind of space, an intellectual space, where writers and scholars and religious leaders began to argue in newspapers, in political advocacy, in open spaces, that Eritrea was a unique, different society and that it was entitled to its own national independence. So that particular era is, for me, the most important. Now, the origins of the Eritrean Muslim League, of course, come out of a previous group, which many of you also probably know of, an organization that, essentially begins not exclusively to be political, but definitely becomes that very quickly. Mahabath Hagar, the Party for Love of Country. This was a group that basically was led by community elites in the cities, particularly Asmara, which tried to change some of the Italian colonial era laws and practices, particularly in terms of dealing with racial segregation, the lack of economic opportunity for Eritreans, and also the attempts to organize politically. Many of the founding fathers of Eritrean nationalism come out of this group. It had, of course, a Muslim and Christian membership, but they were operating in a very challenging period because, as many of you may know, the future of Eritrea after the Italians lost control was very much unknown. There were essentially three possibilities over what could happen to this area, right? This former Italian colony of Eritrea. They could be united or given over to Ethiopia, right? And made basically a province. One discussion was that the primarily Christian highlands, right, could be given to Ethiopia and the lowlands would be given to British Sudan. And in that way, the country would be sort of cut in half and then two entities would benefit. The third and probably the most far-flung idea was this idea of Eritrea becoming an independent country. This was largely overlooked by most international observers. It was not the most popular, again, among certainly colonial officials and even some members of Eritrean society who were aligned with Ethiopian ideas. But these were the core paths that Eritrea could take. And it's in this moment that groups like the Eritrean Muslim League become the most important, because as the 1940s progress, Muslim elements that eventually form this organization, the Eritrean Muslim League, are going to argue that independence is not just the most attractive option and the most practical option, but it's actually the only option to both defend against cultural pressure and to guard against some of the more destructive ideas for Ethiopian control. What's going to happen is Muslim intellectuals, as well as a small number of Christian Tigrinya speakers, are going to increasingly argue that Eritrea is unique and different, and that its very institutions and its survival depend on being a separate entity. So as the 1940s progress, this argument builds momentum. Now, the reason why the Eritrean Muslim League itself is created and why it even becomes a group that is supposedly Muslim in its orientation is because of a very infamous breakup that happens among Eritrean leaders in 1946. This was a very famous conference, right, that happens at Beit Girgish, just on the outskirts of Asmara. This was a political conference that brought together local leaders of all different political ideas and persuasions and faiths and ethnic groups. And it's in this meeting where the breakup of the old group, the Party for Love of Country, occurs. Excuse me, and it's at this meeting where there is a lot of division, there is a lot of accusations, there's a lot of acrimony. And basically it's here where the division of the future of Eritrea is most apparent. You basically have your two groups, those that believe in forming a union with Ethiopia, right, who are unionists, and those who believe in independence. Although it's not exclusively along religious lines, there is generally a connection between religion and the politics. The overwhelming majority of Tigrinya-speaking Christians tend to at least be nominally in favor of union, of creating some kind of connection with Ethiopia. And the majority of Muslims, again, not everyone, but in general, the majority of Muslim activists at the meeting favor independence. This meeting is particularly contentious because there are a lot of accusations, there's a lot of bitter argumentation, and it essentially ends with a walkout led by Ibrahim Sultan, one of the early figures in the independence movement, who breaks away and takes a lot of the Muslim delegates from the meeting. And it's from this breakup that we begin to see the creation of the Eritrean Muslim League and, of course, the divisions in Eritrean politics. So Arabita al-Islami al-Eritrea was created a few weeks after the breakup at that Beit Girgish conference. It's often forgotten, but the Eritrean Muslim League, although it was created with the title, right, Muslim, in its name, it did have Christian members, as well as leaders in the growing labor movement. It also had a very diverse membership of Muslim figures. It had clerics, it had urban-based scholars, it had Sufi representatives, particularly from the Khatmiya Sufi group. And it certainly had a large number of Muslim merchants from the cities. So it had a very diverse population of members within it. Ibrahim Sultan becomes the Secretary General, where he yields a lot of the early power, and he's the principal organizer within it. He largely supports the idea of making one of the members of the Khatmiya Sufi elite as the group's president. And that person is Muhammad Abu Bakr al-Maghani. The Maghani family, as many of you may know, were the key family involved, right, in the Khatmiya Sufi group. They controlled the Sufi organization in this brotherhood on both sides of the border, in Eritrea and in Sudan. So they had a lot of important social and religious significance, but in reality, Ibrahim Sultan and his inner circle, particularly within Asmara, wielded a lot of the actual political power and did a lot of the work. The founding ideas of the group were laid out, written, and then eventually published. Their ideology is fairly simple and fairly straightforward. They basically created a 6-point program in their charter. The first one was that Eritrea should not be partitioned or cut up in any way, under any circumstance, and it should be a united, independent country. Now, although they demanded and expected complete independence, they did argue that there could be a period of transition in which Eritrea would be under a trusteeship by either Britain or the United Nations, so that there would be a transition to eventual independence. So if they couldn't get it right away, it would happen in the near future. They promoted within their ideas, as you can see in point 3, educational and material advancement. This is a period in which many of the institutions within Eritrea are suffering greatly. There is a massive post-war recession happening, a labor crisis, an economic collapse because of the post-colonial transition. There's also a major need, right, for formal institutions to begin to modernize. And many Eritrean leaders, whether they were Christian or Muslim, whether they were pro-union or pro-independence, I think they all recognized this need to develop a more modern educational infrastructure. They also encouraged those fellow Eritrean Muslims to come back to Eritrea, whether they were living over the border, perhaps in Sudan or in parts of Ethiopia or elsewhere, to come back and contribute to the nation as they sought independence. As I said, this emphasis on creating a trusteeship was something that they supported in theory, but the final goal was always to create an independent country. And then the last part, and I think this is very interesting, the 6th part in their charter, as it says here, was, quote, Muslim League representatives will present their drafted constitution to their Christian counterparts, with the hope that the two parties will discuss and be bound together by it. Now, this is important because what is happening at the same time that the Muslim League is being created and formed is that there's also going to be a predominantly Christian group that will also form in this moment, a group known as the LPP, or the Liberal Progressive Party. This is a group that is eventually going to grow larger and larger as Tigrinya-speaking Christians who were part of Marhaba Fikr Hagar are going to break away and form their own pro-independence group. So there is the growth of both the Muslim League and its pro-independence ideas, and then a growing but relatively small Christian intellectual community within the LPP. I think what's very important is from a very early period, you have an attempt by the Muslim League to not only argue that religion, while important, should not be a source of division. You even have the private correspondence, the private letters, the private writings of Eritrean activists in the League that are specifically saying that although they are an Islamic political organization, that the religious differences are not the core issue. The core issue is independence of Eritrea. In a private letter from Ibrahim Sultan to Sheikh Mohammed Nur Hassan, a colleague who was living at the time over the border in Hargeisa in Somaliland, he had a very revealing line. He said, quote, "It's not our purpose to dominate the Christians of our home country or to expand the Muslim religion. The purpose is to reject at all levels the true intention of Ethiopian control. It is an issue on which our integrity and culture depend. Since Allah, the listener and knower, has given us the power of reasoning, how do we stand united with a deceiver and colonizer such as Ethiopia?" So I think this is a good example of the mindset, this attempt to argue that it's not about Christianity versus Islam, it's really about Eritreanness. This different society that developed over the course of previous decades that is trying to maintain independence against Amhara feudal domination. This is an ongoing thing that you see in their newspaper articles, in their writings, in their public speeches. They are really trying to highlight the difference between what Ethiopia represents and what Eritrea could represent as an independent nation. The most important way that this message developed and grew was through the establishment of the League's newspaper, Sawt Arabita al-Islamiyya, or Voice of the Muslim League. This was a newspaper that was published sporadically. It was essentially bi-monthly at times, but in other cases, it had several gaps in publication because of funding issues and because of intimidation. But its first issue goes from February 1947 until the very end of publication in September of 1952. It's estimated that it had a circulation of about 20,000, mainly in the core cities of Batza and Asmara, with smaller circulation in Kern and a few other towns. But it's within the pages of this newspaper, I would argue, that you begin to see the actual ideas of what it means to be Eritrean. It's in this newspaper that you begin to see the ideas of what a future Eritrean society should be based on. It's also in this newspaper you begin to see a very clear effort to embrace not just Eritrea's Islamic heritage, but to embrace the fact that this is a place where both great religions, Islam and Christianity, exist side by side, where people have strong community bonds between each other, regardless of their religion. And that attempt to build unity while also embracing Islamic concerns is one of the League's biggest challenges. What's important also in the newspaper, if you read the articles and you see what they're focusing on, is they have very much an international awareness. There are a lot of articles in the newspaper that are very much concerned about what's happening in places like India and Pakistan, certainly Egypt, which is, of course, a center of early African nationalism in this period, as well as nearby areas like Somalia and Yemen. I think it's very interesting that a lot of the articles in Sawt Arabita talk about the dangers of religious fighting and sectarianism. Because remember, this group, the Eritrean Muslim League, is being created and is growing in membership right at the same moment when British India is being torn apart by religious fighting, by literally the partition of India, where you have neighbors and communities and villages between Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs that are killing each other. And so I think they were very aware of those dangers. And I think they made a very concerted effort to try and limit that by focusing on the unity of the society. And they did that in a very, I think, creative way. They did it by both embracing Islam, but also embracing the Christian heritage of the area and by embracing the dual Arabic and Tigrinya-speaking populations. That international focus, particularly on Islamic protection, on the protecting of institutions, was key. One of the most important figures in this era who really serves as a key intellectual activist is Yassin Batouk. He comes from a very, of course, prominent family from Batza, and he becomes the chief editor for a time in this newspaper. And he very much argues in editorials and in other articles that what's happening in Eritrea is not unique or isolated. It's happening across the Islamic world, where the focus on institutions, the focus on protection is something that is at the core of their movement. So they are simultaneously promoting diversity, promoting the oneness of Eritrean society, but also saying, look, if Eritrea increasingly comes under Ethiopian domination, Muslims have the most to lose. Their institutions, their practices, even issues of language, those will be on the chopping block first if Ethiopian dominance is allowed to develop. So many of these subjects in the newspaper, in the writing, and in their speeches address these issues. Political activism, religious freedom, the promotion of education is certainly a big one. Almost every major issue of the newspaper, every single issue, if you read it, has an article focusing on the need to build schools, to educate the youth, to encourage the new generation to take up the challenges of independence. And in doing so, to embrace a sense of social justice. Many of the early articles in Salt Arabita heavily quote the early surahs and the early messages of the Prophet Muhammad in Arabia when Islam was in its infancy. There is this very much tactical decision to focus on this inclusive idea of Islam, this inclusive idea that it represents a form of social justice to counter a kind of corrupt Ethiopian monarchy. And that comes across in a lot of the articles. You can see it throughout the entire period, this attempt to use certain Islamic teachings and messages to the politics of the time. What's interesting too is that in some of these articles, then again, that are almost exclusively written in Arabic, although occasionally you'll find Tigrinya versions as well, you would have these commentaries written by anonymous contributors who would really take on some of the deeper social norms. There's a few articles that specifically are written by young Muslim women that are published, that are actually calling out or challenging Muslim male leaders to say, basically, that Muslim women need to have educational opportunities in the same ways that some Christian leaders are beginning to support. This was one example. In 1950, an article that was authored by, again, an anonymous author that just called herself female Muslim, wrote an article that basically says, quote, "Dear fathers, I'm telling you in truth, you are in darkness. How can you live? You see the daughters of competitors, the unionists, making constant progress, and you see your best educated Muslim sons chasing after the least educated Christian females and leaving behind the ignorant and uneducated Muslim females. And the reason is you, because you ignore to educate your daughters, and that is why any educated man does not want to associate with them." This is a very radical quote and a very radical idea for the time and place. The idea that you have an anonymous article written ostensibly by a young Muslim Eritrean woman criticizing community elders for neglecting female education. This is quite radical for the time and place. And I think it gives you a window into just how deep this organization and this newspaper could actually go, how bold many of their writers and editors were in creating this intellectual space to talk about what it meant to be Eritrean, what it meant to be modern, what it meant to be a Muslim, what it meant to be a citizen. All these things were happening in the pages of this newspaper and within the meetings of the group itself. They also, again, sort of try to tie in the importance of Sufi institutions. As I said earlier, we know that a substantial amount of leaders in the group were connected to the Khatmiya, the largest tariqa or Islamic brotherhood in the region. And so they made a particular effort to show reverence to the Meghani family and their representatives. They made great effort to sort of accommodate the religious leadership while also trying to highlight the young political leaders that were coming of age. So they balanced a very difficult road. They were embracing Islam and religious heritage, but they were also charting a way forward that was also sort of secular, that was trying to emphasize a modern Eritrea that had its own institutional and educational needs. And the best example of this balance happens in 1949 when members of the Muslim League form a larger coalition with other political groups. The League forms what's called the Independence Bloc with some other organizations. The Muslim League is the biggest group in this new consortium, but they also joined together with the Liberal Progressive Party, or the LPP, which is a Tigrinya Christian-led pro-independence group, principally founded by Walda Waldemariam, as well as groups that had associated more with the Italian settler community or had sort of mixed race Italo-Eritreans. We would call Hanfets, those community members that were the product of the Italian and Eritrean communities. And so these groups come together to form the largest political group in Eritrea while they demand from the United Nations a right to determine their own political future. So again, it shows that the Muslim League and Muslim intellectuals were very strategic and how they were thinking. They were broadly concerned enough that they would join with other non-Muslim groups to build this coalition. And ultimately, you get a sense of that when in 1950, at the height of the United Nations interest in examining Eritrea's future, you have Ibrahim Sultan, who travels to the United Nations in the United States and makes a very strong case that, again, the Muslim populations not only are of a different religious heritage, but that they represent more the Eritrean culture that is unique and distinct from Ethiopia. As he says here to the committee at the UN, quote, having thus no ethnic, religious, historical, or economic bonds with Ethiopia, Eritrea's Muslims are strongly opposed to the annexation to Ethiopia. Owing to the different political structure of Eritrea and the contribution it might make to the equilibrium of that sector in the Middle East, the Eritrean Muslims request the United Nations to grant independence to their country. So there is a cultural and a religious difference that specifically demands, according to Ibrahim Sultan, Eritrean independence above all things. He's not saying create an Islamic state. He's not even highlighting the superiority of Islamic institutions. He's saying that they are different from what Ethiopian control would mean. And so Eritrea's Islamic heritage is part of a different legacy that is unique from Ethiopia, and therefore annexation could and should never happen. As you all know, that didn't occur. You have the creation in 1950, you have the passage in 1950 of Resolution 390A, which creates, of course, a federal system that gradually is going to be eroded, in which Ethiopian control will be brought over Eritrea piece by piece. And over the next 10 to 12 years, what was supposed to be a kind of semi-autonomous arrangement between the Ethiopian and Eritrean government breaks apart into complete Ethiopian colonization. Again, most of you know this, but essentially as the 1950s go on, a lot of the warnings that the Muslim League made about Ethiopian control, they come to pass. They occur, and as time goes on, many of the pro-union Christians begin to realize that Ethiopian domination is really about Amhara domination over all Eritreans. And so you have Tigrinya speakers who are increasingly targeted, who are institutionally pressured. The banning of Arabic and Tigrinya and other local languages takes place. Suspension of Eritrean judicial authority. All political parties, as you know, are eventually banned. And ultimately, by 1962, the federation is completely overwhelmed. And you have this situation where basically all the things that were warned about by the Muslim League are a reality by the early 60s. So to wrap up, and I apologize for maybe being too long, but I would argue that the Muslim League has great relevance even now because it represents this early period that was so unique. This early period was the basis of how an Eritrean identity was formed. It was formed in the streets and in the newspapers and in the discussions of these early generation of activists. It gave later support to the groups that emerged, whether it's both the ELF or the EPLF. They did so by embracing Islam, but also embracing the diversity and the brotherhood between Muslims and Christians. And I would argue that they have a lot of important lessons to teach societies, even the modern era, because as we live in a period of, incredibly vicious sectarian violence and political conflict, they had a very forward-thinking idea and a very forward-thinking set of programs that were formed 80 years ago and have just as much relevance now as they do then, maybe even more so. And so I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned in this early period. And I think that all Eritreans, especially who want to understand modern Eritrea's sort of challenges, could look to the past as a source of inspiration, especially among that generation of leaders who came out of a colonial era with very limited education, very limited means, and yet built one of the most early important African nationalist movements that we've ever seen. So I think there's a great deal of value to examine in this period. I'll leave it at that, and I hope we can sort of chat about it and talk about any issues. But thank you for listening.
Thank you. That's great. Any questions? Raise your hands, and I'll call you one by one. Okay. So any questions? Amr
Yes.
Shah. Go ahead, please.
Amr Saleh Agos, yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, Dr. Joseph. Thank you for your excellent presentation and the nice book. We have been in contact, maybe, if I remember my uncle, Abdul Qadir Hagos, he called it in Egypt.
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah. I have 2 points. The one is, you mentioned that the letter was sent by Sheikh Ibrahim Sultan to Sheikh Nur Hussein. I think it was by Sheikh Abdul Qadir Kabire, not by Ibrahim Sultan, to Sheikh Nur Hussein, who was living in Somalia.
Actually, I think you might be right, and I think in the book I even list that. That might be a typo. Yeah.
Yeah, that is one point. Second point is, at the early stage of Mahmoud Hagar 1941, they had only 2 possibilities, not 3, according to my understanding. That was the unconditional union with Ethiopia or independence, because the third option for partition came better from the British by Bevin Sforza proposal, and was Western Eritrea to be joined to Sudan, which was under control of the British at that time. Yep. And it was a splinter group from the Rabit al-Islamiyya or Muslim League of Ali Radai and someone. Yeah, it came later on. At the beginning, it was only 2 possibilities, not 3. Thank you.
You're absolutely, that's actually all in the book. And actually, when I mean possibilities, I'm not looking at it from what the immediate options were, but kind of what the larger geopolitical realities were. Because if you look at early British documents, even going back to 1940, this is when they were actually fighting the Italians and pushing them out of Sudan. you can read correspondence where they're already thinking about what a new colonial border would look like. And so there is actually a long running British idea of partition there. And so you're right, from the perspective of what activists were fighting for and what they were aware of, you're right. It definitely was either independence or annexation by Ethiopia. But I would argue that there were other broader sort of schemes. In fact, one of the things I didn't mention, although it's in the book as well, is that there was also an effort by the Italians to reclaim Eritrea, to actually get it back. After World War II, there was a lot of scheming in Italy in the post-war government, especially as NATO was still very fragile and in its infancy. And there were a lot of Italian political activists who were trying to use NATO as a bargaining chip to be given back some of their colonies. So there were actually, I think, 4 possibilities when you look at the big picture. But you're absolutely right. In terms of what activists were aware of, definitely those first 2 were the most extreme, and they were the most obvious.
Yeah, I mean, after the Mahmoud Hagar, when it was originally done a society for the interest of the Eritrean people, then the Ethiopia interfered, and then they tried to divide it into 2 parts.
Yeah.
As it said in total, Gergis and that, and that were 2 groups. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
Very much,
Yep. Yes, sir.
Next, okay, Zain Umar, please go ahead. Unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Doctor.
Hi.
And thank you very much for Dr. Do you hear me?
Yes, sir.
And thank you very much for Dr. Venosa. Very fantastic and informative and educational session. Thanks a lot for that. I think the way you put the developments of Eritrean nationalism was so academic, and not only that, but even fantastic, I can say. You give the credit to the people who are highly marginalized in Eritrea of today, the Muslim section of the Eritrean people. We as Eritreans have never had big issues of conflict within us as Eritrean Muslims and Christians. But in today's Eritrea, I think we see some kind of absence of confidence between the 2 segments of our society. And particularly the war in Ethiopia divided us in a very severe way today. And I think we see some elements of the 1940s conflict in today's picture of conflict, and unfortunately. But I think the Eritreans will be able to manage even this obstacles of today in a better way, because we are more educated, we are in many countries, we are well organized, better than we were in the 40s. Many of us are well educated. But the issue is, I just want your reflection on the issue of division that somehow across religion that happened between Eritreans in the way we in these recent developments. I know that your specialization is the 40s and 50s, and you did a great job in that, but we would be more happy to relate history with the current situation in our region, in the Horn of Africa, and particularly within Eritrea. Thank you, Doctor.
Yeah, thank you. No, I very much appreciate the comments, and I can understand the need, to obviously bring things to the present. One of the challenges with when you teach or study history is this divide of, okay, you look at the past, so what, right? How do you make it applicable to now? And I think part of the challenge with Eritrea, or with the situation in general, is that you have a massive diaspora, as this Zoom meeting proves. Eritreans live all over the world. As you know, there's vicious political division. And that means that I think, and there's also a huge generational gap too. So how you are able to create that ability to talk and to engage it is I think impossible right now, because Eritrea is, to put it bluntly, from, this is me talking, I'm not speaking for any group or organization, but Eritrea is an incredibly oppressive state where there is no political freedom, really. So how do you do that in a country that is closed off? I don't see that happening in the country. And so the diaspora, because of its different geographic, generational, cultural differences, is going to make those conversations more divided and harder to create a sort of unified ground. I actually would argue that the politics of the 1940s compared to now are far more advanced, because the leaders were not well educated. In a sense, they had more common sense because they reflected the society of which they came. Remember, most of the leaders, whether they were Christian or Muslim, did not go beyond the 4th grade of formal education. Their education was the social education. Their education was the religious institutions, whether that meant Kanisha schools, whether that meant the Catholic schools, whether that meant the Sufi Khalwat. Their level of education actually, because it was rooted in more local communities, I think was a benefit to how they communicated and discussed and fought for issues. That's my perspective as an outsider, but that's what I see.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to Muhammad Ali Idris. Please unmute yourself. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Can you hear you guys?
Yes.
Hi.
Excellent. Good evening, gentlemen. And in fact, I'm very delighted to attend this meeting today to hear the account of Professor Joseph about the path toward the nation. Interesting, to be honest. And I'm quite sure this book will be added into the Eritrean library. And it will be great tribute to the history of Eritrea. Actually, I don't know how we can get a copy of that book anyway. That will happen later on. But I've got a couple of questions. I'm quite sure the Prof has got so many resources in his book. I wonder if you could just highlight it a little bit for us, the resource of some of the information he included in his book, number one. Number two, my question is it going to continue writing books about Eritrea between the period in 1962 and 1993? It seemed to me like it's a well-informed and well enlightened about the history of Eritrea. And I'm quite sure the outsider, in terms of academic field, I'm quite sure he will be more positive about writing the history, question history of Eritrea. And the last question is, I wonder if you could try to record in a video audience about this book more in details, in order for our young people in the Western world to share and to listen, and at the same time to interact with yourself with regard to this books and other sources, if you might be able to get them for them anyway. And I'm very glad indeed to attend, and I'm quite sure, and everybody here is quite happy as well. And for us, we know a little bit about the history of Eritrea, to be honest, because there's not a lot of material to give us more information about Eritrea and Ocean and the recent history of the revolution as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comments and your questions. I appreciate it. I think I wrote them down, so I'll just clarify. I believe the first question was about sources, right? Was it about where a lot of the information came from?
I think so. That was
Indeed, yes, that's
Yes.
that's right.
Sure. Sure. Well, if you look at the book, and just for clarification, the book came out quite a long time ago. It actually came out in 2014. So that's basically 8 years, and for me, 40 pounds ago.
Yeah.
But so it's available on Amazon. You can order it. It's published by Ohio University Press. So it's pretty easy to access. Although one of the things that has not happened yet that I have tried to work with is to try to get it translated, particularly into Arabic, because I think there's a big audience for it. I have a few friends who had begun to draft some chapters, but I think that might be something in the future worth doing, because it would widen the awareness of it. I don't have the ability or time to do it myself, but I could work with any editor who would be willing to do that. So that might help get some of the information out. In terms of the sources, again, if you read the book and look at what I use, I basically used three things, and I did this because I was trained, and I've always believed this, and this is a big problem with history, and especially with African history, is, you don't need another Ferengi who writes about things that they don't know. You need to know the languages, you need to know the sources, and you need to look at the history as it was examined and lived by the people. And so the basis of my analysis was the Tigrinya and Arabic newspapers and writings by these activists. Many of those sources I was able to get out of Eritrea. I had friends who were able to get the documents that were on file at the RDC. Many of them smuggled it out on my behalf. I visited people with private collections. So I compiled that over time to get the written materials in Arabic and Tigrinya. But I also used the British documents, because the British colonial authorities left very good records. They had, of course, massive networks of spies and infiltrators, and they had colonial officials on the ground who were also keeping track of events. And so I used that as well. And then I use interviews, whether it was from some people that were the children of activists. I was able to interview, for example, the one of the sons of the Eritrean Mufti, Ismail al-Mukhtar, also from, I believe he's in Ottawa now, or maybe it's Winnipeg. But there is a rich legacy of the diaspora that I also tried to consult and speak with. So I tried to use sources that were directly related to either the events written by the people themselves or by those that had direct connection to the events. That was the one thing I made sure whatever happened I had to do, is I had to tell the story from those that experienced it and from what the sources showed me. So that's what I tried to do.
There's a question here, if you don't mind, please. Are you planning to carry on and do some sort of research and books about the period between 62 and 93?
Thank you. I definitely had that goal. In 2016, I began a project where I was looking specifically. I actually wanted to look at basically, I wanted to create a biography of Osman Saleh Sabeh, because I feel like his life would be an interesting window to look at some of these issues and how they translated from the earlier period into the armed struggle. I thought his life was quite fascinating.
Indeed.
Yeah,
Indeed.
yeah, and that has been a goal. That still is a goal. I have to be very honest. As a parent now, and as the father of a special needs child, my son is autistic, and my wife and I, don't have much family support, so we spend a lot of time on our family responsibilities. So I honestly haven't been able to dive in it as much, but that is a goal for me, because I would very much like to use his life, Osman Salah Sabe, as a window to understanding these broader issues, because his life ties in so well with the transition from the 1950s into the 60s and the armed struggle. And that was my goal. I also had a project that I had begun just before COVID, where I was considering doing a very short biography of a particular Djibouti family in Eritrea. And that kind of was something that I wanted to do. And again, COVID, you know, like all of you, I'm sure, kind of changed your lives and your plans. And so that was something else that I unfortunately have not. I mean, I have to be very honest. I'm kind of embarrassed and ashamed that I haven't been an active scholar, you know, really since I became a father, but that is something I would like to do more in the future.
Sounds good. Okay, we'll move on. Johannes Drar, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. First, I thank Dr. And you for bringing, I see here, a bit of diversity, which is unique. We thank you for that. I read your books, and last time, also a week ago, when this announcement came, I reread it again. I am quite sure that you read the book of Travaskis, Eritrea, a colony in transition.
Sure, yeah.
The last chapters, if you recall, brings, if the Muslims in Eritrea liberated, then the revolution could even ignite Ethiopian armed struggle, which happened.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the other speaker, you know, there is this trust issue between Eritreans, especially the so-called scholars. I used to be a member in the 90s when there was this talk of Eritrea will be another Singapore, put in the cart before the horse. In 1991, we missed something. Unfortunately, the ELF is for all Eritreans, Christians, Muslims, but it was a traditional front for the Muslims. A lot of us don't know Haraka, Muhammad Said Naud, and then Hizbawa Hailtat. I was a member of that, EPLF. It was founded, you mentioned it, Sabbe. Sabbe had a good contribution. It was a people from Sahel, whom I come from. I was born in Karanan. I don't want to take all over. The Marias. So the history was more, until now, partisan. 1991, I was saying that we should have forgiveness and reconciliation conference. The ELF and the EPLF resolved their differences by military fighting. It was the TPLF was aligned at that time. So the suspicion is that the Tigrinya-dominated government will come at one time was there, and unfortunately, all Eritreans are suffering. What I want to comment on your say, from 1941 to 2022, it's almost 81 years. This is the modern history or the build-up, you know. Ibrahim Sultan, Atol Dawul, the Mariam, Ra'as Tasamma, which are great, and Sheikh Kabir, who was assassinated by Mahbar Andinat. What I need from you, we have many scholars here. Dr. Gurmai is my friend here at Spa. What's your first name? I forget. These are professors like you. Dr. Tesfagargis, he used to be the editor of the Eritrean studies, sir, okay? I was a member, but I was reviewing all the books that I had. The only person that wrote in that studies was Waldesus Ammar. Okay, so coming to what he said, Arabit al-Islamiyya, because I was born in Karen and I come from the Tigre family, my father was a member of this Muslim League. There is a family in Karen, I don't want to quote, most of them are in the hierarchy of the government, unfortunately.
I'm on a Zoom meeting.
So what I'm trying to address or tell the audience, this is a good gathering. We thank you, Dr. Thomas. Make the links. And what would you say now, the present politics and the 40s? I think history repeats itself. We have to learn from the past. We see now, especially currently, I don't want to go to the current politics, the Muslims, without identifying, saying, you know, giving credits, the Muslim society in Eritrea is a very nationalist. I don't mean all the Highlanders, Christians, we fought side by side. In this current politics, it is different area. Post-Soviet Union collapse. In the 50s, it was Nasserism. Now we are, you know, it's so I wish you write something from 61 to 1971, from 71 until the independence, from 1991, hopefully until now. But Eritreans, we have to do it ourselves. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Really appreciate. I learned a lot again.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet me. Okay.
Thank
Nice.
you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. مع
Okay.
السلامة يا أخوانا.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and we'll move on to Abdulrazak. Please unmute yourself and go ahead and try to make your questions and comments short, so we will have enough time for as many people as possible. Abdulrazak, please.
Oh, will do. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. First of all, I appreciate Dr. Venosa for coming and talking about Eritrea. When I talk to people here in the United States, I'm from Eritrea, they don't even know which part of the United States is that. That's what they say. And I wonder, Dr. Venosa, for one thing, for your interest to write thesis about Eritrea, it is appreciated by all Eritreans. Thank you for doing that, for one thing. I don't have a lot of questions, but one thing is I would say, I don't know if you mentioned it, in 1951, when there was, Eritrea should have been a free nation, and when the people all were asked about Travasky, somebody said about that, about his book, if you read it, and predominantly about 90% Eritreans wants to be free, and politically motivated by the US and other European countries. Eritrea was under the helm of Haile Selassie, which they want him to be the head of state in Eritrea. And eventually, like you mentioned it, he annexed it by force, and the United Nations did nothing about it. And I don't know if you mentioned that in your book. I didn't read your book, unfortunately. I will. And that's all I would say. And thank you for giving me the chance to talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. Yeah, it is in the book. I do talk about it, and yeah, you know, just because he's here, I think it's worth saying. You know, a lot of my decision to pursue Eritrea and this issue was actually because of Dr. Germain Nagash. You know, he was my mentor at Ohio University. He was the one who convinced me to study Tigrinya rather than Amharic. So you could thank his bias for that. But that was the infancy of it. And so, and you're right. I mean, I think, you know, in the West, obviously, like even many people don't even know Ethiopia exists, let alone Eritrea. You know, it's all Africa. So yeah, I think that's one of the things I try to do even in writing, as I do when I teach, is I try to meet people where they are at. And if you have no background, then you have to, you know, I always assume with anyone, assume no knowledge, and try to just present people with a very clear idea. And so that's what I've tried to do. So thank you, though.
I will add a little bit about the book and resources. If you read the references in his book, you would learn a lot about Islam in East Africa and places like that. I actually found a lot of interesting stuff there, and you can read the book, learn stuff, and you can also check the references and find even more. So that is what I want to say. I will go to Gabriel. Please go ahead. Unmute yourself.
How about now?
Okay, that's good. Yeah, we can hear you now.
All
Good.
right. Well, first of all, thank you, Joseph, for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I think particularly interesting to me were the new materials that you presented about the program of the Eritrean Muslim League. It's obvious. My question is related to the relationship between the Eritrean Muslim League and the Liberal Progressive Party.
Yeah.
Not much is known about the Liberal Progressive Party. In your research, was there any effort on the part of the Eritrean Muslim League to influence the Liberal Progressive Party? Although in the final analysis, they ended establishing the independence bloc. I think in the presentation at the United Nations, when Ibrahim Sultan made the presentation, his presentation reflected that of the Muslim League and not the independence bloc. So
Yeah.
I was wondering, was it just the coincidence of independence being the ultimate objective of the two that brought together, or was there any linkage, any effort on the part of the Muslim to influence the Liberal Progressive Party?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. That's an excellent question. And I think I do have an answer, or at least I think the research that I've done indicates an answer. So if you go back, there was a series of interviews that was done in the early 90s, and some of them are mentioned in the references in the book, where they mention early members of the Muslim League. And they talk about how, from their perspective, the LPP and the Muslim League were essentially the same organization, just framed differently for Muslims and Christians, because they almost had to use religion as a rallying point. And what's interesting about that is their program was essentially the same. Their leadership, as you probably know, were quite close. And they had particular leaders who worked together openly and often. For example, one of the most important figures in the LPP was Ras Tesma Asbarom. He was a particularly important figure because he would actually go around with Muslim League leaders and help fundraise and would coordinate meetings and would basically fund the translation of Arabic and Tigrinya documents and articles. And so there was an effort, and they did see themselves as sort of parallel organizations. I think the challenge was the LPP was always a much smaller group because it was a very limited amount of Tigrinya intellectuals who kind of were demonized by some of the more pro-union Tigrinya speakers in that period. You know, their view became the popular one later, but early on, I think they had a much more difficult time because, you know, in that period, religion became the defining feature, right? And remember, you had Tawahado communities, people who were actually threatened, right? If they spoke out against annexation, against union. You know, I interviewed people who talked about how, you know, their grandparents were threatened with, you know, they would be denied baptism for their kids if they publicly supported independence, meaning that the church leaders would not give them the approval, meaning there was a lot of social pressure among some Tigrinya elements. And I think that's why the LPP was never as big or as well known. But their membership and the Muslim League membership viewed themselves very much as, I would say, different branches of the same goal.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Marco, please go ahead. Unmute yourself.
شكرا بروفيسور يوسف غني لنا I read the 6 points outlined under the Rabita al-Islamiyya, and I was really pleasantly surprised and happy to understand that they were forward-looking, progressive, and very inclusive. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if they were based on local indigenous ideals or were based on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. From especially in his years in Medina across the at the Red Sea, especially the Unity University. If you can shed light.
Yeah, no, thank you, and that's a great question. And I think I tried to explain it. I probably jumped over it quickly, but yeah, if you look at the actual Arabic documents, there is a major influence of the early period. You know, as you said, you know, basically the Medina era writings and sayings, and I think that makes sense given the situation in Eritrea at the time. But I would argue that there's something else too. You know, there is a local, there are, you know, again, for all of you who are from Eritrea, you know this, but you know, like when you wake up in Asmara, right? You hear the sound of both the mosque and the church simultaneously. You know, you have people who live next door to each other. You have people who have intermarried to some extent of different faiths. There's always, you know, what I call like a kind of right? This internal diversity that it exists among Eritreans, mainly because I think the Horn of Africa is such a diverse, mixed place. And so I think there is something in the Islamic traditions that are particularly inclusive, especially because of Sufism. You know, the Sufi traditions are by definition inclusive and they absorb. And so I think those early leaders in the Muslim League were very much a product of that era. And they also lived through the Italian colonial era alongside Christians. And so they also had a similar experience and a set of struggles that had more in common than it did different. So I think it's both the historical circumstances and also the kind of cultural ideas of just living together. I think both of those things definitely help explain it.
Okay. Thank you, Marco. And we'll keep on, and please make your questions and comments short. We are running out of time. And Fauzi Saad, please go ahead. Unmute yourself and go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Venosa, and those who arranged this meeting. Thank you very much. I'm really grateful for the information and the education. I personally, I would say that my father was involved. He was a young man in Asmara. In 1947, he attended the conference in Karan, and he was a member of the young leadership of Rabita in Asmara.
Yeah.
His picture is in your book called Ain Falale, a great book.
Yeah.
In page 200 and page 400, he's there as a young man. He was about 25 when he attended the conference in Karan.
Wow.
And from then on, he became a member of Haraka, Mahbar Shawate, and then ELF. I grew up while my father was detained almost every year. And this for me, because I was young and Ethiopia was there, my father never talked to us about what happened during Rabita, because it was very secretive and people were afraid to talk about it after Ethiopia took over Eritrea. And my information was through you and brother who wrote this book, Ain Falale Al-Mushaddad. I got more information. But in 1978, luckily, I met Ibrahim Sultan in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And luckily, my father was there visiting us. And when I met Ibrahim Sultan, he asked me, then I told him, I am the son of Saad Saleh. He told me, I want to see your dad as soon as possible because I'm going back to Cairo. And I told my dad, and I brought him to the house where he was staying. And I remember they started talking about 1940s or 1950s. And my dad asked him, do you remember how you left from Karen to Sudan? And he said no at the beginning. And my dad told him that you were sick, and I and Adam Guduf, a friend of my dad, we came to your house and we told you to leave the country as soon as possible. And we forced you. And he remembered and he said, yes, yes. The friend of my father, Adam Guduf, actually accompanied him to Sudan, to Ibrahim Sultan. Okay. In this book and your lecture today, I'm very grateful because you have informed me on personal level a lot, okay?
Thank you.
Because something I couldn't hear from my dad, I got it from you. But to tell you honestly, that the Mufti of Eritrea was very educated man, very, very educated man. Yeah. And he was moderate person, okay? And his role was very big. I will give you an example. When the conference elected Ibrahim Sultan, who became the secretary, he was the chief of his own tribe, Ibrahim Sultan, that time. Yeah. And the Mufti told Abdul Qadir Kabire to go and to tell Ibrahim Sultan to resign from his chiefdom because he can't take two responsibilities because it will be a conflict of interest. You see? And Abdul Qadir went and told Ibrahim Sultan to resign from his chiefdom from his tribe because you can't be a chief here and you can't be a secretary of a party at the same time. And the role of the Mufti of Eritrea is not expressed too much, but he had a big, big role because the conference of 47 wouldn't have been possible if he was not involved because he had the influence on the tribal chiefs and all the people to come to the meeting. I don't think Ibrahim Sultan would have been able to call the Afar to come or to Shaho to come to a meeting or Abdul Qadir Kabire if it was not the infrastructure of the mosques to collect the people. As far as Rasta Shema, I am from Akologzai, from Shaho tribe. And I know that Rasta Shema was almost a governor of that region. And his relation with Nasir Bey and Hamad Ali Bey was excellent. And there was a lot of respect, okay? Yep. And he was actually for Eritrean independence too. And that relation has good outcome for Eritrea. And now the Eritrean tribes, most of them are made of Muslims and Christians. Like Shaho, we have Christians, mostly Muslims, but we have Christians. The Blaine, they have the same thing. And in lowland Tigray region, there are Muslims and Christians. In Tigrinya, there are Muslims and Christians. Therefore, this tribal mix up has a great to do with accepting each other because you will, in some tribes, you will find the Kagans are of two different religions. And the tribe plays a big role on respecting each other. Therefore, there is no animosity or battle or war between the Christians and Muslims because there is basis to keep them together all the time. But I'm really grateful to you for today. And it is an emotional thing for me to think about my dad, who his young time, he played a role according to his ability. And he was really very, very active man. And even after the end of Al-Rabita, he was a member of Mahbar Shawate, which is Haraka, they call it. And I remember going to prison with my mom, taking food and cigarettes to my dad. And even then when ALF also came, he was a member of ALF. And I remember we moved from Asmara to Karen, okay? And that time also we had he was actively participating. And during that time, it was very hard for him to talk about what was happening because it was secure. It was not possible for people to openly talk about things which happened during a rabbit hour campaign. Anyway, I would like to say thank you very much. Keep your good job. Okay.
Thank you.
And I'm grateful for what you have done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm very grateful that you were able to find value in it. You know, when I hear people talk about their relatives and their fathers and grandfathers, it means, I mean, I'm very touched. I'm very touched because to me that, you know, that's a kind of thing that you don't get to do every day or realize. So,
yeah, it is not only a national history for me, it is part of my father's history.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm
Great.
grateful for that. Thank you.
you.
And I'm grateful for the guys who invited you today.
Thank you, Fauzi.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you joined us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
you. I will go ahead. Joseph, how many minutes do we have?
I probably can stay another 10 minutes if that works for you.
Yeah, that okay. I'm here however long you want to stay.
I'm sorry that I don't have.
Yeah, we have 10 minutes, so make your comments or questions very short, and we'll end this soon. Okay, Bayan Nagash, go ahead, please. Unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the presenters as well as the professor. I will make it brief. I know we have no time. First, you mentioned that there might be an interest in Arabic. I implore you to ask Dr. Gurmai, since he mentioned he was involved in your dissertation, to have him be the person to translate it into Tigrinya. If anything, I think the people who speak Tigrinya need this kind of book. Ignorance is plenty out there. People do not know. The Eritrean regime in power has not done the Eritrean people a service. The identity politics that is poisoning outside Eritrea, out here abroad, we see it. And this recent civil war unraveled the ugly side of identity politics. Of course, the larger politics of the US and the Europe, you see it there with Trump coming to power and all. But I wonder if Tigrinya might be more needed, because Arabic-speaking Eritreans, they have their resources. They've read well. They're well read in Arabic. There is plenty of the resources that they can find. So
yeah,
I know Dr. Gurmai is out there. So hopefully, if he has time, this will be a much needed one. If anything, also to be coupled with audio or visual. You know, optics has become a way of where we consume information.
Yeah.
People don't read anymore. So that's all I wanted to say. I had a question similar to the earlier person who asked about
how about this? If there is anybody who would like a specific question, or maybe we could talk on Zoom at another time. I'm gonna put in my email in the chat, and then if you want to get a hold of me, we can do that, because
sounds good. Okay.
I love chatting with people. Dr. Gurmai knows I talk a lot, so.
Thank you, Bayan. Khalid Abarra, you can go ahead and make it short.
Okay. Thank you, my dear brothers. I hope the light is enough. Thank you, Professor. This is a good opportunity for me. I have read your book maybe twice or even more. I would like to thank you as a scholar. It's a good exemplary type of academic work. As you said, it's our duty as Eritreans or the people of the region to write more about our country, our service, but unfortunately, we haven't been able up to it. So I commend you, your dedication, learning Tigrinya, Arabic, and so on. So I would still would like you, I mean, it would be a great honor for us, for you to do more work like this, if not yourself, at least your students or other people, be it Eritreans or others. I had many ideas, but now I see the time is short. But I would like to have a second one, either like this or smaller or informal, where we can chat and exchange ideas, because we can learn a lot from you. And I see there are many people that I like and respect, are my teachers and my friends like Dr. Gurmai Nagash and others. But what I would like you, do you have any plan to write another one? Closer,
Like I said, I very much wanted to write a shorter biography of Usman Saleh Sabe and then use that as a kind of lens to look at these other issues. That was my real goal after the first book came out. But again, I have very limited time and resources right now. But I, you know, I
said
still,
your email you are going to give us. I was planning to ask
actually,
you
if
your
you check the chat, I've sent it. Yes.
Okay, thank you, my
Yes.
Okay,
friend.
2 or 3 more questions and we'll close. Aida, go ahead, please. Unmute yourself and go ahead.
Okay, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, okay, hello.
Hi.
I joined this group because I am also interested in the earlier history of Eritrea, from early on until the 60s, even now. And I heard what you were talking about. I didn't read your book, I didn't know about you, but I have a interest in, I was fascinated in those days, and I usually ask people from in Eritrea, I used to ask them and record them and document a lot of things. So for me, history is through people who lived by it, not by facts. So it's nice to hear. I know about some of you people. I respect you. So hopefully we can hear more or learn more from each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, Saad, please go ahead and make it short. 2 more after that, then we'll let it go.
Sure, I will. I will go
Sorry.
straight to my
Yeah.
question.
Okay, make it.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Despite my fascination for Mr. Joseph pinpointing the strategic thinking of the League of the Rabita Islamia, indeed they were ahead of their time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Unlike contemporary the Islamic movement, those who are mixing politics with religion, as well as Ethiopia's politics, the mixture of politics and religion, they were secular, and their mention in Islam was, as you say, the rallying point, or it was a tactical thing to achieve Eritrean independence. My question, when you were putting down the dates of Eritrean history, when you come to 1993, you say political independence, not national independence. Are they interchangeable, or you can explain that? Thank you.
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, I think we use them interchangeably, but they have very different meanings, right? You know, it's like love. You can use it in very different contexts. I think it's, yeah, I would say this. I say political independence came to Eritrea because one particular political movement made Eritrea an independent country. But I would argue that there is no real national independence, because the idea of what nationalism is in Eritrea has never been allowed to be discussed, because as many people have said already in this conversation, there was never an attempt to reconcile or to talk about the past or to actually discuss in detail how you integrate all these different people's experiences and ideologies. So yeah, I would say that, yeah, true national independence actually has not happened.
Thank you.
From my perspective.
Okay, thank you. And Gurmai Nagash, I think this would be the last question. And for the rest of you, I'm very sorry. You can type your questions on the chat and I'll email them to Dr. Venosa, and maybe we'll share the answers somewhere on our website or somewhere. Dr. Gurmai Nagash, go ahead, please.
Thank you so much for the privilege. I really do appreciate it. Joe, Professor Venosa, this is really wonderful for me as well, for Ohio University.
You see, you have one Eritrean hats. These are big people, right? They are asking you to write more, give us more, and so on and so forth. So I will keep it very, very brief. It seems like the constellation of ideas that were coming from the Islamic League. I have read your book, of course, when it was being kind of conceived and developing, but the notion of diversity, self-improvement, not to speak of, tatweer, national independence, religious inclusion and tolerance, and then also the international dimension. I was thinking of Bandung conference, of course, because some of the
Absolutely.
ideas being
Yeah.
then kind of entertained as well. So I have one kind of, I have many questions, but I am very interested in your response to this, if you know anything about this. So we don't have these notions of development, diversity, tolerance, right? All these kind of profound concepts, yet we are still, like people were saying, in this dichotomy and binary thinking. A lot is happening today, but I wanted to ask about this particular religious kind of movement. In Sudan, I know people like Mahmoud Taha were very much into Sufism.
Yeah.
And Al-Marqani group in Eritrea as well. Yeah. So if you could a little bit talk more about it, and if there is, what happened to Sufism in Eritrea? Because these are kind of interesting, very interesting ideas that are actually not for the Islamic League, but very, very significant, important, I think, for the nation as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, teacher. Well, it's interesting, you know, I didn't know this until Dr. Howard told me this years ago, but Ustaz Mahmoud Muhammad Taha actually worked in Eritrea for a brief period, I believe as a railway engineer. So there is an interesting connection. But I think Sufism is so important to understanding the worldview of many of the leaders in this era. And I say that because, you know, as is often, and this is, you know, this is not a profoundly new thing, but Sufism generally is viewed as a branch of Islam that is inherently inclusive and diverse, because it absorbs pre-Islamic traditions, it absorbs animistic faiths and practices, it absorbs other Abrahamic religions. And so in a place like Eritrea, especially in Western Eritrea, where the border with Sudan, you know, doesn't really exist, right? These are Western constructs, these are false binaries. They represented the most important institutional anchor of people's beliefs. You know, think of the Sufi groups like the glue that hold some of these community beliefs together, because those ideas of tolerance, of flexibility, the fact that all of these Sufi groups, for example, you know, all of the different ethnic groups, whether they were Saho, whether they were Tigray, they all spoke their own languages, but they all spoke Arabic. They intermingled with Christian communities because of trade and such. So you have those communities, those Sufi groups that were already a part of this. And I think there is a lot in that story that explains the open-mindedness and also the practicality, right? Because they are practically minded people. They were all, most of the leadership of the league, right? They were professional people. They were translators. They were railway operators. They're people who had to get things done, but they had within them, at least the Muslims, they came out of it with a very heavily Sufi mindset, because they were all part of mainly the Khatmiya tradition. There were others, but that was the principal one. And so I think that explains it. And I think I would love for, you know, an Eritrean scholar to really look at Sufism in the region in a way that gets at the heart. You know, there was an Italian scholar, Silvia Bruzzi, who wrote about Sufi traditions in Eritrea, but I don't think she really got into the actual cultural practices. I think it's a very superficial study, but I would love to see an actual Habesha who has the background and the interest and the language to really do it, because I think that would be a fascinating study. So,
Okay, yeah, with that, please join me in thanking Dr. Venosa for a wonderful seminar today. And I also want to thank all the audience, all the new faces I saw today who joined us. And I hope to see you all again. Dr. Venosa, it was an honor and you joined us today, and thank you so much. And
Thank you. I appreciate
Can
it.
you please give Hassan
Yeah,
Ahmed
he has a
5
he has a
minutes, because
statement. Yeah,
he's
please.
the last one and he has some ideas, I guess. Please give him 2-3 minutes. Hassan Ahmed, Mia.
Okay. Hassan, please go ahead.
Can I grab the mic?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate, and I think this is an addition to the Eritrean library. Thank you, Professor. What you're doing is not, honestly, not only an education by highlighting the Rabita, but it is an element that can unify the Eritreans, because there were a lot who were advocating that the Rabita al-Islamiyya was an agent that was propagating against the Christians and so on. And as we see it today, that the same scenario is taking place again by a lot of groups, some of them led by priestess. And as it was, and it will be, I think, but the Muslims will be the valve of safety and unity for Eritrean. One thing that I disagreed about is that Sufism is the unifying element. Sufism is the inclusive. That is not true. All Islam is inclusive, and Islam is a unifying. Islam doesn't, I mean, I don't want to go to the verses in the Quran where it says that لا ينهاكم الله عن الذين لم يقاتلوكم لم يخرجوكم من دياركم لم يقاتلوكم ويخرجوكم من دياركم أن تبروهم وتحسنوا إليهم. God doesn't forbid you from being nice and just with those who don't fight you and don't kick you out of your land based on your faith and so on. So Sufism is just, you know, it's not the element that can unify the Eritreans. Any Muslim can be unified by just believing that there is one God and Muhammad is the prophet, and that's it. So I hope that will be corrected. Since I got the opportunity to raise, to get the mic, one question that I'd love to raise is that America played a role on what happened to Eritrea, big role with like Foster Douglas and so on. So today we are still suffering, even though we paid for the conspiracy that took place, we are still paying the price. What do you think America should do for us to compensate us for this damage that they have done? Thank you very much.
I think this is way out of the topic we are talking today, and we can talk about it in another place. And I think we will end it here. And I really want to thank Joseph again for the time he gave us today. And I want to thank everybody who attended the seminar today. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Just one thing. I don't want to again. I don't want to push it, but there is an article that I did write about the Merghani family and Sufism. I can send it as an email to anybody who would like it. It goes into a little bit some of the issues you brought up and why the politics and beliefs of Sufism are important to understanding Eritrea. It came out in 2014. So I will send that to Dr. Thomas later today.
Me, and I'll share it with anybody who
please. Yeah. Thank you.
We'll let you go. I really want to thank you again for your time.
Thank my wife.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
And if anybody has any questions, you can type them. I will stay for a few minutes, and you can type your questions on the chat space. Thank you, Joseph.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ciao. Thank you. Bye.
Can we get a copy of that recording, please?
I'm going to post the recording in YouTube in a week or so.
Perfect. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.